Welcome to today's webinar, Winning the Battle Against False Positives. Today we'll show you how you can work smarter, not harder, to become more efficient and effective when guarding against attacks. My name is Bill Gardner, Director of Technical Marketing at Awake. Joining me is Fraser Kyne, Senior Customer Engineer at Awake. Awake Security is the leader in the network detection and response technology and has been recognized by leading customers, analysts, and industry relations publications for developing an entirely new way to secure your organization and overcome the toughest security challenges of today. The information we are presenting today has been gathered from hundreds of thousands of interactions we've had with customers and our threat research team over the last few years. False positive alerts have been a major problem in the past and remain as one of the top items for security teams today. A number of recent studies show that as many as 50% of an organization's security alerts are false positives. In this webinar, we'll be looking at why false positives remain such a big problem and demonstrate the Awake approach to solving the issue. The industry has recently embraced machine learning as the next big thing. ML is most often used to find anomalous or unusual behavior occurring in a network. But what is the relationship between anomalous and malicious traffic? We'll take a look at some of the data that Awake has discovered in this area to get insights into how you can tell the difference. And finally, we'll demonstrate how the Awake platform minimizes false positives while increasing detection accuracy, so you can see how your team can achieve the same level of detection and threat hunting expertise as top practitioners. Several recent surveys of security teams show that false positives make up more than half the security alerts they have to deal with. Another significant portion of alerts fall into the category of extraneous alerts. An extraneous alert is information that is reported through the system, which is not relevant to malicious activity. Taken together, it's no wonder that teams are suffering from alert fatigue, when as much as a quarter of their day is spent on time-consuming but ultimately unproductive activities. In an effort to become more productive, many teams simply ignore, disable, or tune out the majority of the alerts generated by the system. History has shown that, of course, disabling or ignoring alerts can eventually lead to major breaches to an organization, such as the legendary Target breach in 2013. Networks and the way we use them have evolved dramatically over just the last few years. The new network presents some key security challenges that not only increase your vulnerability, but contribute to the avalanche of alerts seen today. It seems counterintuitive that new, harder to detect threats result in more alerts, not fewer, but closer examination reveals why these trends are continuing. Unmanaged devices such as IoT, mobile, and BYOD systems now make up more than half of the average network. Systems come and go on the network, and the number of remote systems accessing the network has exploded. Once stable patterns of activity and behavior are no longer the reality for most organizations. This has led to more false positives and noisy alerts from anomaly-based systems in particular. So let's see if we can determine the root cause of false positives today. No detection technology is 100% accurate. Different approaches have been developed to counter specific new types of attacks. As defenses evolve and become more effective, attackers adapt. Surprisingly, as attacks evolve, defenses often become more prone to false positive alerts, as well as missed alerts. As an example, AV engines were developed to detect static patterns contained within infected files using signatures. Early results were very effective and could correctly identify specific forms of malware with very low false positive rates. Attackers then developed polymorphic malware, which changed its form each time it was delivered. So AV began to be bypassed. So vendors broadened the scope of the patterns or signatures in the hope of detecting these new viruses. While they had some success, the number of false positives increased hugely as non-malicious files began to match the broader virus signatures. Signature-style engines are still in common use, although they're often now used with threat intelligence feeds and indicators of compromise. Reputation systems evolved in an effort to keep users from visiting compromised or suspicious websites, or to filter suspicious email senders. In response, attackers developed techniques such as malvertising and fast flux of domains, which swamp or evade these detection systems. Reputation lists became out of date often before they were updated, which increased the number of alerts based on obsolete information. Most recently, anomaly detection engines based on unsupervised machine learning algorithms have been developed to find unusual or anomalous behavior, or events on the network which could be an indication of an attack in progress. These types of systems rely on learning or observing the behavior on the network to establish a baseline, which the system then considers to be normal. Events that fall outside the baseline are then flagged and an alert is generated. However, with so many devices now using the typical network, there really is no normal pattern of behavior anymore. Users with BYOD devices may load new programs every day, which generates new behaviors. Mobile devices may connect rarely or even just a single time. And remote users come and go as well. All of these types of behaviors, which represent the new normal, will often generate an alert in an anomaly-based system simply because the behavior was not observed during the learning period. Let's take a recent incident where a system generated an anomaly alert for a device indicating it is communicating with a new outside location, and then generated a second alert for the device indicating that it's communicating with a suspicious domain, and then a third alert that indicated a large file was transferred. Upon examination, it was found that these alerts were generated when a user's BYOD system connected to the network and automatically mirrored personal files to a cloud storage system the user recently subscribed to, and it wasn't malicious, although it was anomalous. Many of the false positive problems could be minimized or eliminated by integrating the individual detection technique into a single homogeneous system, which uses the results of each engine as input and filters to the other analysis techniques. In this example, it turns out that although this was the first time the system had connected to the network, the system itself exhibited many similarities to others in the network in terms of the applications it used, the types of behaviors it performed, and the destination of the file mirroring application in use. Malicious activity rarely exhibits the same pattern of behavior as a large percentage of other systems on a network. So this should not have triggered malicious alerts due to the context of both the surrounding network and the behavior it exhibited. When examined all of these factors which contribute to false positives, it can be concluded that the root cause for all of them is a lack of context. Like the committee examining the elephant, each individual inspector may be correct about the piece of the elephant he's inspecting, but still be incorrect about the overall shape and the nature of the beast. So what is the relationship between anomalous versus malicious behavior? Extensive research by Awake Labs has found a key aspect of behaviors that exhibit malicious intent is the relationship of a specific entity's behavior versus the behavior exhibited by the larger population. As this graph shows, behaviors that are seen in a large portion of the population, which occur frequently, are typical of benign activities, such as sending and receiving email, updating devices and applications, etc. Less common, but still frequent behaviors are often indicators of normal activity by a group or department, such as accessing specific servers, websites, or applications. The most reliable sign of malicious activity or intent does occur within a relatively small population on the network and does happen relatively infrequently. Certainly not all the anomalous behaviors that meet these criteria show malicious intent, however, particularly in today's networks with a large number of mobile, remote, or BYOD devices. With the traffic loads on today's networks, alerting on purely anomalous or unusual behavior can result in thousands of false positives. However, virtually all malicious behaviors are anomalous. The real trick is to put the unusual behaviors into context. The Awake platform was designed as a single system which integrates the three key components needed to accurately identify malicious intent and reduce false positives. First, Entity IQ incorporates a range of analytic techniques like supervised and unsupervised machine learning, heuristics, and AI, which together build, calculate, and maintain a profile of every device generating traffic on the network. Relationships and values between different aspects of the traffic observed are pre-computed and stored for access by the other elements in the system. This includes generating characteristic artifacts, which represent unique aspects of each device, and using these characteristics to determine the similarities between devices and groups of devices. This process is the key to contextualizing each activity and ensuring accurate, high-fidelity alerts. Adversarial modeling is used to define and analyze activities and values that represent the tactics and techniques used by malicious actors. These models are then applied to the Entity IQ profiles to discover devices exhibiting malicious intent. Models are used to autonomously monitor the network for threats and are the foundational tool for threat hunting. AVA, our virtual security analyst, pre-computes and automates the answers the system and analysts are likely going to need. AVA correlates this information automatically and presents it as a situation, showing you end-to-end attack analysis rather than giving you a bunch of atomic alerts and leaving the correlation effort to your team. AVA also integrates with other parts of your infrastructure to automate response and remediation actions. So now that we've looked at the theory behind the technology, let's take a look at the product in action. So with this, I'm going to turn control of the screen over to Fraser, so Fraser can give us a demonstration.
Thank you, Bill. So let's go into the demonstration platform and let's show you a little bit about this and how we are able to provide the fidelity of alerts that Bill was alluding to there. So the overall goal is to reveal malintent, but to do so with improved signal to noise ratio. That's a pretty lofty goal. So how do we actually go about doing that? And the key way we go about doing that is the word that Bill mentioned a couple of times in his presentation: context. Context is key. Context is king. So the network is considered to hold the ground truth. But the new network, as we call it, modern day networks, are complicated animals. We include in that core and perimeter IT, operational technology, cloud and SaaS, working from home, particularly with COVID-19, of course. We've got contractors, we've got shadow IT and IoT. So what we need to do is be able to do the three things that Bill mentioned. We need to gather the data from this new network. We need to analyze it to make sense of it. Then we need to be able to hunt across it for the information and insights we need to be able to manage our risk. So the way that we gather, analyze, and hunt specifically at Awake and how we approach these steps directly relates to how we can reduce false positives. So first of all, when we're gathering information, we have these Awake sensors that passively pull information from the network. And uniquely, they're actually monitoring and managing that information through layers 2 right the way up to through to layer 7. Commonly, tools look at sort of layers 2 through 4, but we go right the way through to 7. And this gives Awake the advantage of being able to uncover malware and non-malware threats by looking at more than just the metadata of things like protocol headers and so on. And this is the first important step in reducing false positives. An example of this, tangibly, could be some tools could maybe identify as anomalous that a user is connected to Twitter, maybe something they haven't done before. But likely that doesn't raise a security concern for as far as the security team or the business is concerned from their perspective. However, with its more detailed network visibility, Awake also knows that the connection came to Twitter from Microsoft Word. And that application level visibility is something that's really important because that's a tactic that attackers frequently use, but legitimate users are very unlikely to. So other tools would completely miss this context, and thus they'd either flood the analyst with every anomalous Twitter connection or might miss the advanced attacker tactic entirely. So when we're gathering information, we use a technology which we call Entity IQ. And what this does is gives us real context around the devices that are actually on the network and how they operate. So Awake automatically determines what entities and devices are doing on the network and tracks those entities as they move around. So for example, I'm looking at an entity here, and you'll notice we've actually named it, and we've named it with the name of the device, and we've prefixed that with the username, who's the predominant user on the device. And all of this context means that wherever we're going to provide information to the analyst has a business meaningful context themselves for this, because analysts tend to think of things in terms of devices, destinations, domains, organizations, workflow, but too often the tools are in terms of protocols, sessions, or IP addresses. And those sort of things are, particularly IP addresses, ephemeral. So we're going to provide information that is contextually driven about the operating system in use, when it was first and last seen on the network, the range of IP addresses it's been using, and so on. All this information is contextually driven and works to empower the analysts with what they need, including integration potentially with something like an EDR tool that can be used to share information or take actions across the tools to give everything that the analyst needs on their fingertips to be able to make smart decisions. So where this is really important and about tracking and monitoring those entities as they move around is, if you imagine at the moment that we've got a situation where workforces are increasingly mobile, a lot of people working from home. But a real specific example is, let's say a device is being used in the New York City office today, and it's going to be used in the Boston office tomorrow. Awake's going to track that device and associate all the activity to that one single entity. If the visibility is limited to network information, the device likely was going to have a completely different IP address tomorrow as it's on a different LAN or VLAN. And so it's going to be considered to be a different entity. So what ends up happening is not only false positives, but you're going to spend loads of time as an analyst trying to correlate that information manually. And wherever there is a manual process, it leads to risk, it leads to false positives, leads to annoyance, and it wastes everybody's time. So the way that we're actually able to gather this information and create this Entity IQ device profile is through something we call fingerprints in the product. Now you can think of these fingerprints as actually characteristic artifacts. So if we talk about artifacts in general, we're talking about any piece of metadata that can be extracted from any network session. But characteristic artifacts are those specific things that the device does when it operates on the network. And we can use these specific things to identify entities and groups and provide context for the activities they're doing. So I like analogies. This is a little bit like human beings. Today, I'm not sharing my video because I have a face for radio, unfortunately. But if you saw me or you met me in person, you would know that I'm 5'9", I'm bald, I wear glasses, I have brown eyes, I have a beard, I speak with a strange British accent. And likelihood is that if we met in person or you saw the video, if in 6 months' time you saw me on the street in Sydney, Australia, you'd say, that's Fraser from Awake, you'd recognize me. The same thing's true on the network. So we want to be able to create and maintain this long-term ability to actually recognize devices, because devices are coming on and off the network. They're appearing in different ways. They could do sorts of different things. And that long-term tracking and visibility is extremely important and adds to the context of how we recognize what's going on. So these fingerprints, these identifications, these characteristic artifacts enable us to start to build an understanding of how a device operates, but also critically, it enables us to associate similar devices. So other devices on the network, which are in the peer group. Now, they're different enough to be different entities, but they share characteristic artifacts. They share certain things that they're doing, fingerprints in common, and so on. So by being able to kind of work all this together, we start to work out what is normal for a particular device, what's normal for a group of devices. And we're not just then looking at anomalies, because as Bill's alluded to, not all anomalies are bad, not all bad things are necessarily anomalies. We've got to be more subtle than that, and context is key. And we want to make sure that the platform drives the context for you to build that information together, so that you don't have to worry about pulling all of that stuff together for you. It helps you join the dots. It also means that we can include this context and incorporate the machine learning and data science, which has gone into building this context, into the detection models. And that in turn reduces false positives, because we're interested in chaining things together and the relevance and context of them. So all of this stuff is extremely useful in building up something we call the security knowledge graph. And this is really when we get into analyzing the information that we've gathered from the network. So the security knowledge graph is a build-up of entity correlation that identifies where the entities are, as well as the relationships among them, the attributes they share, which entities are similar to others, as we're showing in the UI here. So for example, another thing we can look at is we can look how other devices get grouped. So for example, within the security knowledge graph, all the Polycom phones will be grouped together. So if I just start to do a free search in the platform, as soon as I type in the search, it's going to say, what are you searching for? And I want to search with any devices that have Poly in them. And you can see here, we've got 5 Polycom devices. If I grab into one of those, I can then see how they're grouped together and the logic of the fingerprints, the association between them. And you can see we've automatically grouped 5 Polycom devices together because they're of course similar devices. But it could also be something like all the devices in the finance group or the HR team and so on. So the knowledge graph is essentially an underlying data store that was created and patented by Awake, and it helps us to understand an entity's behaviors and how these may differ from its peer group. So again, it's about connecting the dots so you don't have to, and enabling you to then go and mine the data to pull the relevant information out. But critically, not based on things like IP addresses, which are ephemeral, but actually on business context. And the really cool thing is it does this without having to baseline. As Bill alluded to, baselining has a number of problems. What baselining often will do is it will accept existing malintent that's already present on the network as normal behavior, because you've got to start from somewhere and you've got to start the baseline. And all too often our customers tell us that other tools have misunderstood what was happening, and there are things that were going on in their network that were blind to because they were just baselined as normal behavior. Also, as Bill said, networks are dynamic. They're changing all the time. So these tools need to relearn patterns of behavior over time. And we just don't really think that that model can keep up with the new network and how flexible it is. Whereas if we actually analyze the entities of the devices, and we can carry that model also into domains and other things like this as well, then we can bring that context to bear, because we get to know the personalities on the network a little bit like we get to know me and how I look and so on, and the analogy I made earlier on. The other benefit we have of the security knowledge graph is some machine learning tools are limited to analyzing things like network messages, ports, and protocols. And this really presents a challenge when trying to detect modern threats that often blend in with business justified traffic. So trying to do that with low rates of false positives may be extremely difficult to do. Whereas Awake extracts a rich set of features that are based on the net effect of network communications rather than just the port and protocol information. And this context is critical. So for example, it's one thing to identify a packet as Kerberos, but quite another to differentiate between a successful and a failed login attempt. And this enables much better high fidelity detection of malicious behavior with lower false positive rates. So now we have Entity IQ, and we've got the security knowledge graph, and we've got all this context. We want to hunt across this information. We want to find out what's bad in the environment or the things that we should need to know about without being drowned in meaningless alerts, which when we investigate them turn out to be not interesting. So what Awake have also done to make this really easy is we've developed something which we call adversarial modeling and adversarial modeling language. And at the highest level, what this language is it provides a vocabulary for you to be able to ask your network questions. It also enables us to codify TTPs and have the system look for them on an automated and ongoing basis. Now, this is a big topic for another day, Bill. We haven't got time to go into that today, or we know. So we'll cover that another day. But just at the highest level, these detections are automatically provided by Awake. So we'll tell you when you need to know something, and we'll help you prioritize the things and the devices that you should be looking at first of all. And these detections are automatically provided, but you can also build or edit them yourself. So if there's a very specific thing that you want to know about your network, you can find it. You can automatically search for it, and then you can tell the system to automatically search for it in the future. So probably the best way to show you how we do that and talk about false positives and reduction of false positives as we go along is to follow a logical thread. So the thread that we're going to follow is this. We've alerted that something interesting is happening on the network, and we can alert within the UI of the system here, or we could also find that as we move around the system, when we start to search for things interactively, we publish the information of what are the automated detections, the adversarial models that we've fired on this environment. So let's have a look at this particular one. It's called exfiltration, scripted like PowerShell, upload to a cloud service or uncommon destination. And you'll notice everything is aligned with the MITRE ATT&CK framework in how we sort of present this information. So what is this one all about? So we can actually look at the model and see what it is that we purport that we founded. Now, on the system, we're going to tell you, like probably a lot of tools, what we think we found and why we think it's important. Of course, we need some context that's just built into why are we looking for this thing in the first place, and most tools will do this. They'll tell you, what they were looking for and why you should be worried about it. But uniquely, Awake actually tells you how we found it. We actually exposed to you our adversarial modeling language, which we used ourselves to be able to search for this TTP. And the really great thing about this is it shows that everything that Awake does is entirely transparent and it's fully extensible. So if you looked at our model and you say, Awake, I don't really agree with you, or in my environment, I want to tweak it just slightly, you can change it. Think of this like Lego. You can take a piece off and put a different piece on, or you can sit back and trust Awake to do it. Now we create and curate these models ourselves. So our experts are always enhancing this and adding the latest data, and you've got all the benefit of the brain trust of Awake pouring into this. But the great thing is we don't hide any of this from you, we show you. And you'll also notice within this particular model, there's all sorts of client cipher suites being populated. So Awake can provide you with visibility across your networks, even with encrypted traffic. And we take encrypted traffic analysis extremely seriously because we believe the market will be increasingly trying to work with encrypted traffic, and it is impossible, or certainly impractical, but in many cases impossible, to decrypt all of it, not just from technology perspectives because the cost and the complexity of doing it, but also for privacy reasons. That stuff's encrypted for a good reason. So if you are going to decrypt, you're probably going to want to do it surgically and not wholeheartedly, but you don't even have to decrypt to get the data from the system, and you'll see that as we go along in the demo. So we believe this is happening. Tell me about the device that's doing it. So when we click on the system here, we're going to go inside and show the workbench, which is going to tell us who did what and went where. So we've got the who here, where did they go, and what did they do? So immediately now in the UI, we're showing the information and relevance that the organization would need or the analyst would need to be able to track this through. So you can see you can pivot to the information from anywhere, but under devices, we provide the device name as we showed earlier on. We also provide the IP, of course, but then we can click from here and we can pivot and we can say, show me more about this particular device. Before I investigate this potential bad thing that they've been doing, I want to have a little look at the device. So we can then see back into this screen, the context of the device, similar devices, and what it's been up to. So we might want to go back and say, when was the first time we saw this behavior? When was this activity going on? How long for has it been going on? This is all relevant context as well. So we can scroll through and find, well, when was the first instance of this happening perhaps, or when was the most recent? There's all sorts of data available at our fingertips. And then we can jump from here into a specific time frame and say, show me the data for this particular time range. The other thing we can also do from here is to say, well, what else were you showing me? Well, you also showed me the domains that people went to, and the domain said it was gmail.com. Now, that doesn't strike me as particularly malicious, although it identifies up here that it's the behavior we're interested in, not necessarily the fact that it's a location, but it's chaining the things together. It's A, then B, then C, but only if D. So we can then look at this and say, well, I want to pivot this way. Tell me about Gmail on the network, gmail.com. What other devices are going to this particular domain? And we can see that we've got loads of information about the particular domain, including the who is information that we can register and look through. Obviously, gmail.com is a reputable domain. We can look at all the different IPs that domain has been using. So again, context, everything at my fingertips. And then I can see, well, 20 devices on the network communicated with it. Here's the top 10. So I can see that this isn't the only device that's communicating, but it's the only one that's doing something in an interesting way. And perhaps it's the only one going to smtp.gmail.com. So again, all this context available at my fingertips. When we go back then and analyze, we can see that the only device that's calling this behavior is this particular one. And why is a Polycom device talking to Gmail? That seems unusual to me. So we can then look at the activities and we can say, well, when did this happen? How did it happen? What did it do? We provide the summary information here at your fingertips, and then you can click on details. You can say, I want to find more about this. I want to go into the details and look at the extracted data. Where's all the context? Layers 2 through 7. of the extracted data of these communications. We can learn a lot from these and how they're operating. We can even have a look at the captured data. We'll store the PCAPs on the network for a period of time, and you can pull them in. So you can actually look at the captured data within the UI in different formats, or you can export the PCAP and analyze it later for forensic purposes. You could even take that and decrypt it if it was encrypted information, but again, you're doing it surgically. The key point is to provide all the information that's needed at the person's fingertips as an analyst so you can make smart choices. So we've got all this context, we've got all this information. We can help you find the needle in the haystack and bubble up to the top the relevant information. The final piece then to show you is how do we organize it? How do you organize it? How do you present it? How do you make it available to your internal teams? You can share this information in a number of different ways. It could be output to your SIM tool. It could be shared with your SOAR, so you could automate different behaviors. You can integrate your EDR tools with it and work as a piece of a jigsaw puzzle in a wider security context. But what you can also do is organize your thoughts within the platform. So anytime you find something interesting, at any pivot point in the UI, you can simply drop down and say, I want to add this to a situation. So what situations are is an overlay service which enables you to organize, document, and report on interesting activities. So anytime we add something to a situation, you can initially think of a situation as like a logical folder into which you're going to drop things and then organize your thoughts. My personal way of explaining situations is you can think about a situation a little bit like an attorney. If you're an attorney, you're going to go and present a case in court, then you're going to want to get all the information that you need in one place. You want to gather all your thoughts, so any questions that the judge may ask you, you've got good answers to. So the situations provide a model for doing that. Also, in a more simplistic sense, the situations give you a place to actually get things down and logged. Whereas a lot of the time we speak to organizations, they say that the information they have is in the mind of an analyst. It's on a piece of paper or a Post-it note on people's desk, or it's buried inside a system and not exposed in an easy way. So when we add something into a situation, we're going to throw it into a folder. This particular thing that we were looking at here, this information, we've got a situation that was created earlier from this. So when we drop this into a situation, a number of things will happen automatically. First of all, the system will generate this graphical attack sequence display to show you in a visual way what's actually going on. And this is extremely useful for explaining the attack and just visualizing the different steps. What the system will also do through Ava, the Awake virtual assistant, is she will work almost like a virtual member of your team. She will go off and enhance by looking horizontally across the business what other devices potentially were impacted. We only told about one device. Was there anything else we need to know about? What other context can we add across the business horizontally? But also enrich vertically by drilling down into particular topics. So if we add some information about a particular domain, maybe Ava will go and do some open source intelligence on that domain or provide the IP addresses for that domain and so on. So it's like having a virtual member of your team where you've narrowed down contextually on the right information, and now you have a way of presenting, documenting, and reporting on that. So the system will then build up exactly what was going on, and it provides a means and workflow for us to document the things that we're investigating and assign these to people in terms of investigation options and response. So again, going back to this idea that this is like an attorney presenting a case, we're going to want to know what happened. We want to have the proof of what happened. What was the impact? And then what are our investigation options where we dug further into it? And then what are the response options in terms of remediating what was happening and making sure we've got an audit trail that we can see everything that was done by different people. So what actually happened in this particular instance was the system told us about a very specific behavior and TTP that was of interest. We provide the context around which devices were doing it, why this is interesting, why it was acting in a way that is unusual compared to other devices. It enabled us to find the context of the domain that it was going to, but read between the lines and connect the dots for us for why this was interesting in this particular scenario. And then when we gather the information together, we've got a simple way of organizing our thoughts. And what actually happened in this particular case was what we saw was a specific Polycom device was communicating and uploading information to Gmail. Now, there are other Polycoms in the business, but they weren't behaving in this way. So what wasn't interesting wasn't Gmail. What was interesting was a device that doesn't normally do this and whose other devices don't normally do this started doing something which was very, very strange. So it's an anomaly with context. It's not just breaking the norm, because the norm is broken all the time. What actually went on in this particular scenario, because this is a real situation from one of our existing customers, was that they had an IT contractor who was working on their systems, and he was secretly putting a specific Polycom device, the device in or near the boardroom, near the executive offices on the executive floor, and was putting that Polycom into an admin mode and fault finding mode, where it was recording audio as WAV files to check the audio quality. He was then sending those WAV files off to Gmail and then storing them on Gmail, accessing them on another device, and downloading that information for all sorts of potentially illegal practices. Now, this is something that Awake found because of the way that our models work. And this was behavior that had been baselined as acceptable and normal behavior by other tools because it had been going on for some time. But Awake very quickly saw this with context that was anomalous and presented the information, and all of these communications were encrypted. So we didn't have to look inside the encrypted stream to know that this shouldn't be going on. It didn't expose that to any people who weren't supposed to also be listening to those audio, but it just showed the security team what was happening. And then if they wanted to, they could then reach in, grab the PCAPs, analyze them further once they had permission to do so. So I'm just going to round off there and hand over back to Bill and finally say, in summary, if you remember nothing else, the key thing about this in terms of reducing false positives is context. Context is king, and you need to be looking at systems and tools that enable you to get that context so you can read between the lines, stop you having to chase your tail to find the information and find out that after spending 3 or 4, 5 days, a week, 2 weeks investigating, that your trail runs cold because it was a false positive and it was a waste of time. Get that context and make things really easy on yourself by letting the system join the dots for you. Over to you, Bill. Bill, back over to you.
Thanks, Fraser. Sorry, I was on mute there. So in summary, rather than chasing a never-ending stream of false alerts, security teams need to work smarter, not harder. The root cause of false positives really is a lack of context provided to the individual loosely coupled detection engines that have grown organically over time. Designing and developing a cohesive analytic system which can determine malicious intent based on the tactics and techniques used by attackers provides superior accuracy while reducing or eliminating false positives. So with that, let's see if we can take a couple of questions from the audience. Okay, so we do have a question come in. How are the techniques you demonstrated different from the other integrated solutions on the market?
Yeah, good question. So there's a lot of tools out there, right? There's a lot of ways you can approach this problem. So I think the key difference is how the different detection engines interact together to produce the contextual inputs used by the analytical component. So how do the bits of the tools work together with themselves or share information across different platforms? So most solutions today have realistically developed over time. And as new detection engines were developed, they were effectively bolted on to the earlier engines. Now, the earlier engines, of course, were designed to use the data from engines that of the time. So it wasn't possible to build into those tools like future-proofing and understanding all the things that would be possible in the future. And what that inevitably means is the net result is it manifests itself by a flood of unrelated or inaccurate alerts. So that's the worst thing that can happen out of that. What was different about Awake was the team that built Awake had the luxury of being able to start with a clean slate. and take a step back and analyze the problem and say, what would we do if we could start from scratch? And that was really effectively what they did. So they're clean slate and said, knowing what we know now, having worked with all sorts of different security professionals and spending time just listening, learning, interviewing, watching what people do, how they work and everything, Awake spent a long time doing that before building a product. So it was being able to take that step back and say, right, we're going to start from scratch. So we had really the luxury to design in the capability for the analytics to ingest new forms of input data and to continually refine the context and accuracy of the results. So that's something we'd, if you want to know more about, by all means, contact us and we'd get into more detail on that. It's a kind of a long-winded answer, but effectively, Awake was built to do this from scratch with all the benefits of hindsight, really. And it's a product that was built by threat hunters for threat hunters.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Fraser. Let's take a look. Here's a question from Sahil. Will I have to write my own models or tune the Awake models to decrease the number of false positives?
Yeah, so I mentioned during the presentation that the adversarial modeling language is unbelievably flexible. It's transparent, it's extensible. But the key thing is to tell you is out of the box, the Awake models, the adversarial models, the pre-configured detections already deliver probably at least an order of magnitude better accuracy with fewer false positives than other tools. And this has been shown in independent testing, and more importantly, it's been proved in real customer deployments. So the box itself comes with these things built in, and our experts at Awake are creating and curating these models all the time. So you're getting the benefit of that system always being fed, always being tweaked. So having said that, though, you know, we have to admit, you mentioned earlier on, Bill, there's no such thing as a perfect detection engine. I mean, Alan Turing proved this in the 1930s. So while Awake's false positive rate is extremely low, and even though the Awake models are constantly reviewed and improved by the research team, it can always be improved. So no, you do not have to write your own models. You do not have to tweak the Awake models, but Awake was built with this idea of transparency, which is why our adversarial models were designed to be completely transparent, comprehensible, but editable by the average security operator. So no, you do not need to create your own models. You do not need to tune the Awake models, but if you want to, you can, and we expose to you and help you with the ability to do that.
Okay, really good. Let's see. Here we go. Can the results of the analytics be used by other systems in my organization to improve their performance? I think you touched on this during the demo, Fraser, but again, probably good to summarize that.
Yeah, the simple word is absolutely. Awake believes that we have a role to play within this, but it's a jigsaw puzzle, and we believe we provide a really important piece of the jigsaw, a corner piece if you like, but we have to integrate and we have to play friendly with the other tools you're using, not least because there's no silver bullet in security, and we have to make sure we are functioning well with the things that you've already invested in, and frankly, you've bought other tools because they're good at doing a job. We just fill a gap that no one else really fills. So we support at Awake integration with a range of different security solutions such as SIEM, SOAR, firewalls, EDR systems, and so on. So out of the box, we're going to work with your favorite vendors, more than likely, and we've built those integrations into the product. And that roadmap, by the way, for more integrations is purely driven by customer demand. We're extremely responsive in doing that. But the really cool thing is all of those things are built from our documented API. And that API exists so that even if we don't have an integration, you can use that API with assistance from Awake if you need it to build integrations with specific things, like even bespoke in-house developed applications you have, but certainly commercial products that you're using that aren't on our list of enabled already got a tick against the box and fully integrated into the platform. So yeah, absolutely, we believe in playing friendly. And if you look at our website, we list a number of the players that we have direct integrations with, and we can easily integrate into others using open standards and our open RESTful API.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Fraser. And with that, it looks like we're going to go ahead and wrap for today. I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time and attending today. If you'd like to share or view the recordings, they're going to be available on Awake's YouTube channel. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter for more of our insights. We look forward to seeing you at the next Awake Security webinar, and you can visit us at awakesecurity.com/webinars. Thanks again, and have a great afternoon.